Okay, it's turned on, and my name is still Mike Dekema, and today is November 6th, 2013.
Okay.
Tell me your name.
My name is Gale Judkins,
And Gale, where were you born?
Bremerton, Washington,
How long have you lived here?
42 years.
How do you pronounce the name of this town?
Corinth. Unlike Rita, who says it's Corinth, and that's actually how they say it here, but I say Corinth.
And you, well, first of all, you were a nurse, is that correct?
Yes.
Tell me about your career here in Corinth.
In Corinth? Well, first off, nursing to me was a calling. God called me in and He called me out. I loved it. Not that I didn't have some stressful times and some bad days like everybody else. Nursing was a joy. I had worked in some other places before we moved here, and came for an interview when my husband came here to work. I was 5 months pregnant and interviewed by Peggy Woodhouse, precious friend of mine, who also was a Baptist graduate from Memphis where I went. I hadn't known her before. She hired me on the spot and apologized for the low pay in this area. And what was so funny, I had worked in Maryland and Oklahoma and Tennessee, and the pay was higher here than it was anywhere else I had worked before. So I was pretty excited. This was in 1971 when nursing pay was not what it is today. I worked full-time until I had my baby, and then I worked part-time. Enjoyed it a lot. Loved hospital nursing was my favorite, but I worked in other venues. I did some school nursing for a while, and I worked at the health department, and that was different.
In what way?
Well, my first several years of life I was on the West Coast, and then we lived in rural Arkansas for a little while, but not as rural as some of the areas I had to visit here. So, and then I lived in Memphis and worked there, and then we lived on the East Coast and I worked there, and so this county in the rural sections was not as developed as it is today. It just was different. I told somebody at the health department one day after I made a really long run out to visit some people that I felt like I'd stepped back in the 1920s. And that was an experience, and it was also really interesting because they lived like in the 1920s, and they didn't have electricity, and their water was in the well, and they had newspaper for wallpaper on the walls, and it's just what they knew. But I had the privilege of seeing a glimpse, nearly 30 years before I was born, so that was kind of interesting. And then I went back to the hospital, and I worked there a while. Worked in the emergency room, worked in the cardiac cath lab, worked in the intensive care, and then I left and went to work at Memphis for a while. I did a weekender program. It worked better for my family. That was when the better pay started, and I worked 2 12-hour shifts at night. I worked with a group of girls, and we rented a place, and it was actually just as lucrative to do that as anything else, and we got paid for 40 hours. That was when weekender programs first started. It was in the early 80s, and that was fun. I learned a lot. They told me that I would be afloat on the neurosurgery units, and there were 2 of those. Not the intensive care, but the step-down units. They said I would float those 2 floors, and maybe a couple of others. And I worked there for 3 years as a weekender, and they had 23 nursing floors in that hospital, and I worked 21 of them. And all but 2 of them, I was charge nurse on nights the first time I ever went there. I grew up a lot in the early 80s in Memphis, but I came back to Corinth and stayed there until I retired. Worked med-surg, which some people think is not the glamorous part of nursing, but I think if you can't work med-surg, you really can't work well anywhere, because it's kind of like ICU without monitors and ICU without all the windows. I loved it. Loved it. Worked with some great people, some great doctors. Had some wonderful patient relationships. I love nursing.
How does nursing in a small town like Corinth compare to the same job in Memphis or a larger city?
You see your patients at Walmart. You go to church with your patients. You're in clubs with your patients and their families, and it's a close bond. And at our hospital, we had patients who would come back and ask to be admitted to certain departments, certain floors, because they knew those nurses and they liked them so well, that's where they wanted to be. And for the most part, back in the day, if they could, they'd accommodate that. That was fun.
And now you're with the Genealogical Society.
I am.
How long have you been doing this?
We organized, I think, in 1992.
What drew you to the society?
I started doing genealogy in 1990, looking for an Indian I'd heard was in my family. And in doing that, my father knew where his great-grandfather was from. And it was 120 miles from here, Giles County, Tennessee. And he knew that because it was on his headstone in northwest Arkansas where he's buried. So I didn't know. I just loaded up my parents and off we went to Giles County, Tennessee. And I was going to find everything I knew about my family. Shortly, I learned that you don't go where they started out, you go where they ended up, and then you backtrack as you get the information and you follow the paper trail back. So I was one day looking at the information at the museum here in Corinth, because they had a lot of genealogy information, and I had learned that my husband's family actually came to Corinth and lived here for many, many years. So I was trying to find something about them, and I ran into Betty Robertson, who also turned out was doing genealogy, and we talked about the lack of a genealogy society, which would be a repository for local information. I talked to Dr. Dennis Ward, who was a surgeon in our town, has since retired, and he had been a genealogist for years, and is in the Mayflower Society, and his wife is in the Jamestown Society, and she's also a doctor, Dr. Mary Ward. And we got together and decided to advertise in the newspaper and see if anybody cared about doing that. And I was amazed at the people who showed up at the library who wanted to start a society, and we just took it from there. Do you want to know why we do genealogy?
Yes.
How do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been?
Good answer.
It's just like in society in general, you know. If you don't remember and know what happened in the past, you'll repeat those mistakes. Or you won't continue to develop things that were a good thing in progress. And so I think I just look at it that way. Some people don't like history. I can't imagine that. I love history. But when I found out that Benjamin Franklin was my 10 times cousin, what did that do for my historical information and my family's place in history? It just puts everything in perspective. We were watching Gone with the Wind last night for the 15th time. And when they showed all the soldiers that were wounded, laying out, being ready to be transported, my great-great-grandfather was one of them. He was shot in the thigh at the Battle of Atlanta and received a pension later for that wound when he got older. It just, you put your family in time. So it's just, I think it's a delightful hobby.
An interest in the local history, and I'm not talking about Shiloh now, but an interest in Corinth history seems to be endemic here. It seems
Yes.
Everyone seems to be interested, almost regardless of age. Do you think that's somewhat unique to this town? Is it more common through small towns in the South? Or?
I think it's common to small towns in the South where the battle had such an impact. The battle was right in their front yard. Mm-hmm. The Corinth was right at the crossroads, a block down the street. Mm-hmm. Did you know that And we're not going to get into a lot of the Civil War information because that's done, but did you know that most of the civilians evacuated?
Evacuated the town?
No, evacuated town and went south. A lot of them went to Pontotoc County.
Okay.
And I'm not sure why Pontotoc, because they had some skirmishes down there, but not like this Battle of Corinth. It was further away from the railroad. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people who could evacuate, especially the women and children. And then when they came back, there wasn't a lot. They burned a lot here. I understand from the people in Holly Springs, which is about 70 miles to the west of us, that they heard what happened in Corinth and Iuka with the burning, and they offered their homes to their officers politely, and there was only one home burned in Holly Springs.
Other Civil War towns that we visited, near Antietam, near Fredericksburg, the Civil War isn't just a national park, it's kind of a cottage industry of people selling bullets and things.
Yes.
We don't see that here.
Ours are more in the museum. Most people just want to show them. I think you can buy them in places, but it's more about just preserving the history of it.
It seems more academic and less commercial here than in other cities we visit.
It's more of a learning thing, a teaching thing. I guess if you're on the losing side of that war, you tend to replay it and hash it over, if we had done this, if we had done that. But it was such an impact. If it had just been the war, the 3.5 years that it was, pretty much in this area, I guess that would have been one thing, and then everybody just went back to life. But we were occupied, and we had the Reconstruction period, which was brutal. They would boil a particular kind of weed, and I forget what it was, and that was their coffee, because they couldn't afford coffee. If you look at our tax books during the Reconstruction period, they taxed the people unmercifully. If they had a clock, they had to pay tax. If they had a dog, they had to pay tax. And I think that probably was more of an impact, actually, than the war itself, in my opinion, because for the South, the war lasted much longer than 3.5 to 4 years. It lasted almost 20. By the 1880s, things were perking up a little bit. But by the 1880s, a lot of people were leaving on wagon trains and going west because memories, just start over, just, get away from the war-torn part. A lot of people went west from here. Big wagon trains left this area in the 1880s.
How far west did they go?
They started out in northeast Texas. And we have people all summer long coming here from northeast Texas looking for their roots. And they find them.
I don't think we ever realized the meaning of the term down home till we came here.
That's right.
And it seems an awful lot of people born and raised here do leave and then come back home.
They do.
And it gives the perception that this is a good place to live.
It's a wonderful place to live. I cried all the way here. I cried all the way here. I was going to Mississippi. My husband promised me we'd go somewhere else within 3 years. Who wanted to leave after you lived here for a year? It was a beautiful place. The people are wonderful. It's a great place to raise a family. And we have a good church home. We have friends. We love these local shops. I don't plan to go anywhere else.
And obviously, the Genealogy Society is doing quite well.
It is. It is. We have wonderful researchers that come in. We have it from everywhere. Not so much from the east, except Alabama, but we have the people from the west come here every summer. Sometimes in the fall, sometimes in the winter. Depends on their age and what their agenda is. Family reunions are occurring, and they'll come on their way to or from, or they've just learned a tidbit when they were here visiting, so they come down and yeah, we have so many wonderful success stories.
And there's a mandatory Elvis story. Every person here has a mandatory Elvis story. Tell us yours.
Wow. The first time I saw Elvis, I only saw him twice. Once he was in a car driving by. I went to school at Baptist in Memphis, Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, and that was his hospital of choice. So we'd see him in the car, you know. Oh my goodness, I have a friend, still in touch. She was our next door neighbor in the dorm at nursing school. She was from Missouri, and she's an Elvis fan. Oh my goodness, more than me maybe, I don't know. Every time she would see him drive by, she would scream her head off. And I told her one day, I said, Kathy, you've got to stop doing that. But it's Elvis. I said, he lives here. This is his town. Everybody sees Elvis. Quit screaming. But he and his wife had Lisa at Baptist, and we were all lined up like little penguins, you know. We got to stand in a little semicircle by the nurse's desk when he and his entourage came to pick up Lisa and his wife and Priscilla. He stayed with her the whole time. And pictures of them are in our annual with some of our student nurses who took care of her. They actually were very delightful. The whole end of the hall was barricaded off, of course, because it was Elvis. So they were limited on the number of maternity cases that were on that floor that particular week. But as they came around the nurse's desk, I could still see he had on that gorgeous royal blue outfit, pants and jacket, light blue turtleneck, no makeup. He was so beautiful. He stopped and spoke and thanked everybody. And he was just so gracious. He always was. And then he was going to be in concert in Memphis one summer. And my husband wouldn't go with me. Oh, I don't want to get in that crowd. And take your friends, take your mom. Nobody wanted to go, so I didn't get to go. It turned out it was his last concert in Memphis. I still hold a grudge about that. I shouldn't do that.
How long has it been now?
About 36 years. I'll let it go one of these days. My father, when he retired from the Navy, worked at Memphis Airport. He was a policeman. At that time, Memphis Police Department had the division at the airport, and they weren't like security guards. They were actual policemen. And he usually had to go when Elvis was coming back or leaving or whatever. They all took turns, of course, doing that, but Daddy frequently had to go. They would park, they did come up to the main gate, they parked out, and they would bring him in, you know, to kind of cut down on the crowd business. But my dad said of all the celebrities that he escorted in out of Memphis, and there were a lot of them, you know, that used to come perform there, whatever, he said by far Elvis Presley was a pure gentleman. He said he just, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, and thanked everybody. He said he was so gracious. He said it was just a pleasure, you know, to assist him. And everybody in Memphis kind of felt that way. He was just a good guy. One of the nurses from Baptist was waiting for the bus one day, and he was buying in Lincoln at Schilling on Union Avenue, and she was just admiring a car. He bought it for her. He bought it for her, and he was just generous.
Timing is everything.
Timing is everything. Yeah, those are my Elvis stories.
This has been wonderful. Any other stories concerning Corinth or any of this that you'd like to add? That you think we should know about?
Oh my goodness.
You'd like to share, let's put it that way.
After I leave, I'll think of a lot, I'm sure.
You can
What can you tell us about, is it Bill McPeters?
Bill McPeters. He was a second generation funeral director. His father started the first funeral home business in Corinth, probably about 1918, 1920. Bill was a flamboyant person. He loved to dress. I don't want to say for attention, but I guess that's what it got. He would come up to visit friends at the hospital, and you knew it was Bill before you could see his facial features. He'd be wearing a big white Panama hat with a red band around it and a feather sticking out the side and a red sports jacket. white shirt and red pants and either white or red patent shoes. And he always stopped at the nurse's station and told the latest joke, the latest news in town, and then he'd go about his business. He wore green, he wore purple, he wore canary yellow. You could go to his funeral home and do research because of the funeral home records, because it has who the parents were and all that kind of thing. So gracious, just whatever you needed, he was willing to do, and he will long be remembered. He passed away last year. He will long be remembered. I think they were in 2 or 3 locations here in town, and Bill was fun.
Did I hear the other day that funeral homes used to provide the ambulance service?
Yes. When I moved here in the 70s, the ambulance service came. I left the hospital in 72 and I came back in 76, and the ambulance service was a year old. So 1975 is when they got the ambulance service. And yes, the funeral homes would provide the hearses, and we could put an oxygen tank in there if we needed to. We had to load it up, of course, with our, if they had with hemorrhaging or whatever, we had to take our supplies, because hearses, traditionally don't carry that sort of thing. The first time I had to ride in one to Memphis, this was the 70s, dresses were short. And I had on I thought it was just a cute little short dress and my little white stockings and my white shoes. We didn't wear pants then. Nurses didn't wear pants or scrubs, heaven forbid. Well, I did. That was my first time to wear scrubs outside of working in a department that required them. I was getting ready to get the ambulance, and one of the ambulance, the hearse driver said, "Gale, come here for a minute." And I said, "Okay, what?" And he said, "We're going to be traveling and people are going to have their headlights on. I think you need to go put on some scrubs." Because of bending over taking care of the patients, it was coming up too high. So I wore green scrubs. And when I got to Memphis, I ran into the emergency room, ran into an old classmate, and she said, "Are you a doctor now?" Because I had on scrubs and a stethoscope around my neck. I says, "No, I just had on a short dress when I started out." But it was an adventure. And they got us there. Mm-hmm. The first time I went to Memphis, 72 was 2-laned. Mm-hmm. It's only been 4-laned 15 years, I guess. Lots of hills as you came this way, so it's kind of hilly. Mm-hmm. It is 100 miles from our hospital to Baptist Hospital emergency room. We went 90 miles an hour, and we got there in 1 hour and 5 minutes.
In a hearse?
In a hearse. Down the middle of the highway on the stretches. But it was the way it was.
Patients weren't at all uncomfortable.
Nobody seemed to mind. It's just the way it was. It's just the way it was.
Can I, so you've, when I've talked to you, you've mentioned a couple of times that you cried all the way to the town. If you can think back to your first week here, what are the sort of the vivid things that you remember?
I cried all the way. Well, and like I said, I was 5 months pregnant too, so you cry over everything. But and I'm just expecting to see Delta mud and flat, and we came off of Highway 72. We came around on Fillmore Street and came up, which is the main street in Corinth. We came up the little rise, and there were all these little shops on each side of the road, and straight ahead was First Baptist Church. And so we just went that way. And all those, they say tree-lined streets, tree-covered streets, that's what, there were canopies over the streets. I was just startled how beautiful this little town was, and all the pretty old homes. Mm-hmm. I was pretty much sold that first day. Fine, we didn't have a place to live. My husband was hired over the phone, so we stopped first at the airport where he started out working, and interviewed, and then we came into town hoping to find a place to live, and we found a place that day. The landlord couldn't have been more gracious. The neighbors came over to meet us. I mean, we were truly in the South, bring a dish over, welcome to the neighborhood. Would
that happen today?
Probably in some parts of town, but not as much as it used to be, back in the day, but probably still. Probably still. We still had the welcome wagon then.
I get the sense that it would happen today, just based on everybody we've met.
I think it would. I mean, we haven't moved since, but I know other people have moved in. You go over and greet them. When our neighbors moved in a few years ago, we went over to greet them. It's just a thing to do. It's just a thing to do. I think somebody mentioned the other day when you were speaking to them, you just speak to people whether you know them or not. In some places they think you're kind of, because I've done that in other places, just not thinking, hi. And they look at me like I have two heads because they don't know me. I thought you were supposed to speak to people when you pass them on the street.
Everybody here speaks to us. I think that will do it.
I do too.
We obviously really appreciate you
Well,
taking the time.
I don't tell good stories like
Thank
Rita,
you
but
for
thank you
this.
so much for asking me to do this.
I'm going to turn this off. You don't mind if I turn it off
No.
too?